Well, some of these discussions, particularly of how immediate acts of censorship may be very effective in the immediate time and space, but then have the opposite effect farther out. In contrast with, as Corey was saying, what happened with hip hop is making me think about how, while we can often look at censorship and information control together, this is one of the spheres where we're seeing big differences between them. That the legacy and consequence of something that gets called censorship, and that people talk about as censorship, and that percolates out through everyone's consciousness as there is censorship happening, has a very, very different aftermath, and it seems more likelihood of having backfiring or shaping protests or counters or resistance or other forms of things than forms of information control that might have a similar choking effect on circulation or thought or output, but that don't get called that because they get called licensing or copyright or the way that we're monetizing or protecting a particular thing. And if it doesn't get called censorship, people don't respond to it in that same way, and it doesn't have that same second-tier legacy.
In China, I guess we have an overemphasis on censorship elements and an underemphasis on other means of information control. The use of patriotic messages that flood the channel, and so on. One of the most immediate effect of searching for banned information in China is not punishment, it's having your internet connection slowed down or possibly shut off for a few hours. And it's a way to condition a reflex, not a way to actively identify dissidents and punish them necessarily. Right. Though Google's app, Project Dragonfly, does affirmatively identify people who make banned searches and stores it and relays it to Chinese political authorities, that, from what we understand about Chinese censorship, looks like it's more like a backstop or maybe a pretense. If you need a reason to round someone up, you can use a search history, but it's not the main mechanism. The main mechanism is really a very a large, mostly volunteer group of public, patriotic bloggers, basically, who flood channels. And we have giant leaks of their control systems, of their control channels, where they talk to each other about how they're going to coordinate their efforts. There was a long held belief that they were doing it for small amounts of money. They're sometimes called the 50-cent army because they get half a renminbi per post, allegedly. But it seems like that was overstated too, based on these leaks, that it really is a huge patriot army of people who, every time someone starts talking about certain kinds of action, mostly collective, in-person action in the streets, not complaints about corruption necessarily, because that's a way that factions in the Chinese ruling elite can attack one another, is by identifying inefficient or corrupt elements and that are under the purview of a different ministry and going after them. But actual student demonstrations, like the ones we've seen with the young Chinese communist groups going to Guangzhou and Shenzhen for big demonstrations to shut down factories, that's where they actually target it, and they flood those channels with just talk about sports, talk about the weather, talk about how great stuff is going, and did you hear that amazing song, and here's a viral video. And it's much more effective, I think, than just the raw censorship.
I had a chance to listen to somebody who was a children's author in Lebanon, and she was saying that very strict controls by the state, so they couldn't do they couldn't be a dog in the house, they couldn't show a pig in the children's thing. If the woman doctor was going out, she had to wear headgear. And she said, but this backfired in an interesting way. What happened was, as teenagers got older, and as they began to try to make sense of a life that was now lived mostly on the internet, there was nothing that was permitted in the Lebanese language to help them make sense of that. And so this whole attempt to try to make people patriotic and nationalistic, in fact, tethered them to a childhood that didn't work for them when they got to be old. And so they went to English, and so they call it the mother tongue problem, where the attempt to control the language meant that people were leaving the language behind as they got older.
Marianne's comments about the chilling effect in those silences and the question of, how we measure the successes of censorship is also an important one that I revisit a lot, because often what we're looking at is, the real result is largely the things that didn't get written or that didn't get shared or that people didn't say, which gets very difficult to document in contrast with the material that people did say. And sometimes it'll be X person decided not to write a novel or not to publish a novel. Sometimes it'll just be X person wrote 2 fewer novels in their lifetime because they lost all of that extra time to the sapping effects of the exhaustion of living in fear, the exhaustion of being anxious, the exhaustion of putting your works through lots of vetting processes before sending it forward, and then the ultimate exhaustion of having a work get in trouble and how that slows things down, or the way Chinese censorship is affecting Hollywood movies because they don't want to produce something that's going to get held up before it's Chinese release because they lose money. So they'll edit the script from the beginning to remove things they think Chinese censors might have a bone to pick with.
So I'll give you an example of that. I was working on a YA fantasy series, showed the first book to my agent. The second book, I said, is going to have a lesbian protagonist, right? And hadn't written the book yet. And he came back to me, my former agent actually, but he came back to me with, well, is it a book about being a lesbian? Is it an issues book? And I said, no, it's a fantasy novel. She goes off and saves the world, blah, 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 right? But she happens to be a lesbian. He's like, well, do you have to make her a lesbian? Because if you do, we're going to lose all the Southern Library sales, right? And it was like that very concrete thing that he knew that this percentage of the market was not going to pick up the book as a result.